First shot at what I'm tentatively calling Qigong Radio, and I'm here today with several Marriage of Heaven and Earth Qigong instructors to talk about that Qigong set, the Marriage of Heaven and Earth. In a couple months, or in a few weeks actually, I'm starting a new course at Brookline Tai Chi about the Marriage of Heaven and Earth, and so what I wanted to do, I wanted to get some people together to talk a little bit about Heaven and Earth, sort of where it is in the whole energy arts curriculum, what you kind of get out of it when you practice it as a Qigong set, and also maybe talk a little bit about how the Marriage of Heaven and Earth relates to Tai Chi and Qigong as well. I'm sorry, Tai Chi and Bagua. So we're going to kind of go through a few different topics on the Marriage of Heaven and Earth. And the first person who's going to speak a little bit is Energy Arts Senior Instructor Eric Peters. And he's going to tell us about what it was like to learn this set for Bruce Frantzis for the first time in 1982 in Denver. So I'm going to turn it over to Eric for a few minutes, and he can tell us about the origin of the wood exercise, which I think is what it was called back then. So Eric, you want to start us off here?
That's right. Back for the 3 years or so in Denver that I studied with Bruce, he used to do 5-element seasonal intensives over a weekend. He apparently did them for as much as a week long before I started showing up on the scene. But we would go to the school on a Friday night and practice or do things for several hours, spend the night there in the school because it was a protected space. And there was a Taoist altar and so on, and then we would get up at 5 in the morning and do several more hours and then come back in the evening. But we also sometimes would go out to some of the parks in Denver. And because he taught Xing Yi back then regularly and Tai Chi mostly, he used these seasonal intensives to primarily help get people to manifest and understand the energy of the season, often in an emotional context, but also sometimes in the context of something to practice with. So it was easy to fit it into the Xing Yi because of the 5 elements. And sometimes he did this mostly with standing, but in 1982, in the spring intensive, we ended up learning what was basically the beginning of the Marriage of Heaven and Earth, which, as Danny noted, he called the wood exercise at the time. We learned basically, what you would know as the external movement, but the main emphasis when we were practicing it was we were out in one of the parks in Denver, and we were doing it with the trees, and he was very much into not only the wood element itself in the sense of expansion and growth, but also the emotional qualities of anger and to some extent the subliminal qualities of grief. And it was when the trees were beginning to bud out and the energy of spring in Colorado was very strong. And we were practicing with the trees, and it was a little different than what he's done later, where it's easy to stand or practice with a tree and get the sense of rooting down into the ground and reaching up to the sky. This had a stronger emotional context that he's never really done much with again. But we also, at one point during the thing, also focused on the idea of expansion in the body. And I didn't do Xing Yi, but in the Tai Chi form, we had to practice that several times, going through a series of letting, getting a sense of expansion, and then getting a sense of the joints opening. Now, in that weekend, he didn't teach anything about how to open the joints, but he brought it up as a subject, possibly for the first time. It's hard for me to remember now. But on the subject of opening the joints, which is one of the central parts of the exercise, he later, when he was getting ready to close his school down and go back to Beijing to study with Liu in the spring of 1983, he said, I'm going to stop teaching you all these forms and teach you something that's important, because you may see me again, and he went through a systematic, just as he does in Heaven and Earth, but without the exercise. We went through opening and closing all the joints of the body, and then putting that into, in my case, the Chen Tan Ling Tai Chi form and the Yang style simplified 24-move form, which was the Tai Chi that he taught in Denver, and for the Xingyi people into the Xingyi. So before he left, we'd actually not only learned that the exercise itself, but began to play with opening and closing the joints.
Interesting. So you said that you guys would do these seasonal intensives all the time, and this was kind of the spring version?
That's right. Yeah, we did the 5 seasons, and he would, this one happened to be, I can tell from my notes, in early June, but he would, about a month beforehand, he'd time it when he thought the energy of the season was really changing. And so it would be, well, we're going to do this maybe in about a month, and then he would keep talking, and then all of a sudden it might be, oh, it's going to happen this weekend. And then we would do whatever we did.
So when you got this sort of the wood exercise, this rudimentary version, how different was it from what we've all learned later on as the marriage of heaven and earth? I'm showing, this is just a coincidence, everybody, that Eric was at the school, I don't know, maybe that was even a couple years ago, and I took a bunch of pictures of him teaching heaven and earth. So it's only a coincidence that I have those pictures up with Eric speaking in the background here. So was it similar?
Externally, I don't know that it would be any different than what you would expect now. He didn't, with the only difference being that he did not really put bowing the spine into heaven and earth, at least whenever I took it from him, until the teacher training in 2004. So he used to do it with, maybe you lightly would bow your neck, but basically it involved bending and sort of pumping from the qua with a slight bend, but basically keeping the spine straight. And so other than that, it was, the external movement was all basically the same thing.
I see. And from the beginning, you guys were working on integrating it into the other practices as well, Xingyi and Tai Chi.
Yeah, but it was integrating that more the quality. Initially, it was trying to integrate that expansive quality of the wood energy. It was really more. It was more from the point of view of the energy of the element than from taking techniques or skills that are inherent in the practice of the heaven and earth exercise, and then putting them into Tai Chi or Bagua or Xingyi, or more advanced Qigong for that matter.
I see. Let's actually talk about that a little bit. Let's talk about sort of where heaven and earth fits in with the other practices. And for this, anybody can kind of chime in. If you're teaching heaven and earth or you practice it, let's just go through some of the big things that you focus on in heaven and earth as distinct from some of the other practices. Does anybody want to start us off with that stuff? When you do your heaven and earth, what are we focusing on here? And Eric, you can keep going if you like.
Well, somebody else must have something to say here.
Yeah, Lucy, why don't you go ahead?
It's more actually a question, is that I've been doing a lot of Tai Chi recently.
Yeah.
And I was, just the other day, to be honest with you, I don't practice marriage of heaven and earth all that often. And I was just doing a set or two the other day whilst I was waiting for a piece of toast to cook, as you do. And then I was doing my Tai Chi afterwards, and I was suddenly, I guess, much more aware of the potential of putting some bending the bow into the Tai Chi. Mm-hmm. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, perhaps?
Yeah, Eric, do you want to put that in context, and maybe we can then circle back around to it at the end? Specific, because as I understand it, and anybody else can chime in here, you want to be pretty comfortable with the bowing before you start to do any of that in your Tai Chi. But Eric, how would you qualify that?
Well, I'll back up a minute. For a long time, again, until this training we did in 2004, where he really started talking about the C curve and bending the spine in certain ways, he used to teach with heaven and earth, opening and closing the vertebrae or the spine and the plates of the skull, and since and then he sort of dropped that from the teacher training and said really that whole part of heaven and earth is a continuation of the marriage of heaven and earth, but it's really more a part of Bend the Bow, and he's occasionally taught certain things about Bend the Bow and bowing the spine in Tai Chi. He has pretty consistently said that until your Tai Chi is very, very stable and until your Bend the Bow is pretty good, that he's never recommended trying to put it into Tai Chi, because in the marriage of heaven and earth, or if you practice the simple Bend the Bow exercise, it's symmetrical, and both arms and both legs are doing the same thing. They're maintaining the same shape. But in any Tai Chi move, you've got usually a weighted leg and an unweighted leg, and you're forward or you're back or you're to the side, and then one arm is doing one thing and one arm is doing the other, and that creates or can create a variety of pressures on the spine, and that if you and so what he said pretty consistently is that if you start trying to do that without some fairly good control and understanding what's going on in your body, it's easy to start to distort the spine rather than use it in an efficient way and make the practice healthy for yourself. Because in the advanced Bend the Bow, for instance, if somebody hasn't done it, he teaches techniques where by holding the hands and the arms in different positions, sometimes symmetrical and sometimes not, how you can actually target specific vertebrae, or you can create, or sometimes for people with scoliosis where they have a curvature in their spine, by having one hand up and doing something in one direction and the other hand down and going in a different direction, you can target that particular curvature and begin to unbind it. But you could really do the opposite of that to yourself if you weren't careful, where, let's say you were trying to bow the spine in brush knee and twist step, your upper hand and your lower hand, if you weren't careful, could create uneven pressures on the spine that might end up, causing you more problems.
Now, also, it's worth pointing out here too, right, Eric, that we talk about bowing the spine from a really technical point of view. Working with the spinal bow in heaven and earth and working with the spinal bow and Bend the Bow means slightly different things in terms of the anatomy of it, right? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think it's a matter of degree or continuation myself, but in heaven and earth, the spinal bowing or encircling hands is really trying to access the spring of the spinal ligaments and getting the spine to bend in a unified fashion, and really as sort of one piece. But once you have that in Bend the Bow, you're still bending the spine externally. I suppose it would look pretty much the same, but you're working on opening and closing all of the vertebrae and the spaces between all of the vertebrae at the same time, which you're not really worried about or trying to focus on in the beginning levels in the marriage of heaven and earth.
Got it. Now, Eric said something provocative to me the other day, which I'm not going to repeat here, but I will tell you something different. No, I'm just kidding. Sorry. No, we were talking about this sort of question of the place that heaven and earth has in all the other sets. And he said to me, and hopefully he'll cop to this and repeat it and explain it, that in some ways he thought heaven and earth was sort of the first place that you're really dealing with internal work, as opposed to something like energy gates, which is actually slightly externally focused initially. Can you explain a little bit what you meant by that?
Yeah, well, some of the questions you asked about possible topics in this conversation got me thinking, and again, going back to that training in 2004, Bruce used an expression about what we were doing with heaven and earth in a way that he'd never used before, that I could remember, and he talked about penetrating the shell, which was really saying we were beginning to go inside the body, and I started to think about that, and if it's easy for us to think, oh, all these practices we do are internal. But if you look at least energy gates on a beginning level, while you're standing and you're dissolving is training you to put your mind inside your body and to feel inside your body and maybe even begin to do something with the energy or I suppose the tissue to get it to release. That takes a long time, and a lot of the focus is on alignments, and a lot of the alignments really in the beginning, while you could say, well, I learned how to hold my alignments a certain way and maintain them because I have an internal sense of what that means, there's also a lot of external stuff going on. And so you're beginning to sort of understand what it's like to go inside your body in energy gates, but a lot of the quote-unquote internal techniques that are physical or energetic that you can do in Qigong or Tai Chi or Bagua or Xingyi, you really can start to learn and train specifically in the marriage of heaven and earth, because you're starting to, you need your mind and your body to open and close your joints. That's a physical process, but it also has a mental component, it has an energetic component, and you're causing something to happen in your body. When you're opening and closing the cavities, you're causing something inside the body to open and close. You're getting fluid to start to move in certain ways, because a lot of the cavity work really has to do more with fluid movement. But and then there, as you get into more advanced techniques of the marriage of heaven and earth, the same thing. It's beginning to get the inside of the body to function in a certain way, much more so than energy gates. And then you can go back and put this into energy gates, but that's what I was thinking of when I said that.
So I have one of the slides here that sort of says, I've heard Bruce explain before that heaven and earth is kind of a bridge from the more basic to the more advanced practices, and I think you've just sort of given one plausible case for why that's true. Is that? I mean, do you see that as a continuation into the more advanced stuff in Gods and Bend the Bow or spiraling, that you're doing more internal movement the same way?
Yeah, you're learning more internal techniques. You're taking the techniques and the specific things of heaven and earth, and then you're using them in the other exercises as well. So even in heaven and earth, there's things he's taught that begin to play around with the aura or the energy of the spine, spinal breathing, and those are all things that he's also taught in, for instance, God's playing in the clouds or the etheric body and some of the other Qigong. So it provides a good foundation. He often has said that if you had to do one Qigong set and that was all you could do, that the heaven and earth was probably the best thing to do for yourself.
Yeah, I always, I think that's always kind of funny, because you have the desert island proposition, right? You could only take one Qigong set with you to a desert island or deserted island. Which one would it be? But of course that's ridiculous, because if you were stuck on a deserted island, you could practice all of them. So, but no, we definitely talked about that. And just as you were talking about this, Eric, Don was saying that the first line of his instructor training notes from Heaven and Earth talk about penetrating the shell. So I think you're not alone as a notorious note taker either. Don, do you want to talk about that for a second? And
I'll talk about what, I'm sorry.
So just the from your notes here, and what you said to me about the 16 Negron in terms of heaven and earth.
Yeah, like I said, the first line of my notes corresponds to what Eric was just talking about, and as you've said, that's often, Bruce will often kind of hit the most important thing first as the first thing he talks about. So in a lot of ways, that is a very important aspect of the system. The other thing that I remember Bruce saying at some point regarding the 16-part Negong is that even though opening and closing is one of the items in the list, I remember him saying that really if you look at all 16, all of them in one way or another are some form of opening and closing. So if you get a sense of that one, it can be applied to learning all of the Negong elements.
Interesting. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Say kind of what you think that means, because I think I have a theory about that, but I'd love to hear what you think that means. It sounds great.
Why don't you give your theory and let me think a second?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that Eric sort of alluded to when he was talking about energy gates, right? He said that on some level you've got the physical alignments that you can think of as sort of an external thing, right? But the one thing that you said that was so critical about that is that you have to get the mind to somehow get inside the body. So if that's the central problem in energy gates of landing the mind inside the body, what you start to do in heaven and earth, and maybe Don can tell me if this is where he thinks it's going, but what you start to do in heaven and earth with opening and closing is you start to pay attention to tracking what's going on internally. So now I'm not talking about fluid movement, the space inside the joints, anything else like that, but thinking about what the mind has to do. So in energy gates, it's sort of the butterfly flying around, and you stand there patiently and long enough, and the butterfly finally lands. You finally get the mind to be comfortable resting inside the body. And that's sort of what you get into in the dissolving practice and everything else with energy gates. But once you get into heaven and earth and you actually start to get a handle on how opening and closing works, for most people it's just so foreign from how we think about using the body. So that speaks to this being internal-external bridge. But the quality of mind that you need to use and develop to track an opening and closing is then the same kind of quality of mind to feel, think about it in terms of wavelength or sine waves or something like that, right? You've got this peak and then it turns over and drops into a valley and it turns over. And so you've got the sort of the period of the opening and closing as something to pay attention to. That trains your mind and your awareness in a really specific way that when you're just doing standing, say, you don't quite notice. So I don't know. I think that's kind of my theory on how that works. Is that, Don, how plausible does that sound?
I think that's a good thought about how it might be designed to work. And if going back to thinking about it in terms of the 5 elements, if you think about the way things grow, they don't just start from a point and in a linear fashion grow. If you do time lapse of a plant, it grows a little bit and then goes back a little bit and then grows some more and goes back. So it's kind of developing that sense of awareness that you need to pay attention to things going on inside.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that about plants. Yeah.
In a sense, if you think of, not to get too stuck on the elements, but energy gates is water, so it's like planting the seed and watering it, and then in this set, you're kind of encouraging its growth, giving it the things that it needs to develop and thrive.
Oh, interesting. Everybody's homework assignment is to go out and watch grass grow, so you get this principle. And so as you guys have, and anybody can jump in here, but as you guys have gone on and tried to translate this into other practices, does that seem right? Is that the kind of stuff you've taken away from heaven and earth and put into your other practices? Go ahead, Sito. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, going to what you were saying about the opening and closing, I think In a way, and I didn't know a lot of this, even though I've probably heard it from Bruce many times, so I really appreciate this discussion and you guys saying all this. The idea that the opening and closing in some way is part of all the 16 elements, I think, is very fundamental, because it's really, I always think of this as zeros and ones. You know, when it gets down to it, you have yin and yang, you have opening and closing, and the way you shift your weight and all of those things. So it seems like this as an exercise in its focus, and it's almost linear focus, even though nothing about this is linear. But because of the symmetrical aspect of it, there's a linear nature that kind of helps keep the focus on something like opening and closing, which, as you said, really puts your mind and your body in a different way, and makes it easier to get and hold on to that aspect of this and put it into these other things. So in that way, it also, again, is a bridge, because it allows you to bridge a physical and an energetic thing and a mindfulness thing, and it really helps with the whole mindful quality of all my other practices.
Say a little bit more. Run with that a little bit. Talk about sort of how you see that translation into the other practices as well.
Well, I mean, in a kind of a surfacey, obvious thing, the movement of the qua, not as much maybe of the bowing of the spine as Eric said, because it's much more difficult to keep that together when your arms and legs are going in all these different directions. But the qua, for example, is something that when I do heaven and earth and really get a focus on how that's pumping, I'm able to put that into the other practices. But the biggest thing is the mindful quality, I think the way you said it, of being able to follow the pulsations,
mm-hmm.
right? Because at a very fundamental level, this is all about the pulsing of the universe, the pulsing of, I can't feel my blood vessels, but I've heard Bruce talk about that, right?
Right.
So at all these different levels, there's pulsations taking place, and it's kind of something that you can both attach to and kind of ride it, but also guide it. And so that helps deepen the practice. So there's a kind of a physical thing going on with the quad, but then there's also a mental thing going on with your attention and your mindfulness, and there's an energetic thing going on with riding those waves that you're creating through the pulsations.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. I think that's a nice way to put it. What this kind of brings up for me, because I think we've hit on sort of what makes, as a technique, what makes what makes teaching, what makes doing heaven and earth and getting into opening and closing such a different kind of experience for most people. So I want to circle back around for a second and just talk about teaching this stuff. And Eric, if you take us back to Denver for a minute, I know for me, and I know at that instructor training in 2004, and most of the exposure I've had to learning actually how to open and close has been, it seems like it comes more from Bruce's Qigong Tuina background. Back in '82, and when you guys were doing this, were you learning it more in a martial arts context, or was the Tuina part of the teaching method at that point?
Well, my memory, and I don't know, he didn't let us take notes in class back then. And a lot of what notes I have, I used to write down afterwards. So
you're just trying to make up for lost time now.
Mind. I know, I'm catching up, but so I'd have to go back and it's been years since I've looked at the notes of what we did then, but I think that I think we must have. I mean, the effective way of teaching it is using what would appear to be what you're calling Qigong Tuina techniques. Is really just manipulating someone's body so that you're activating that particular joint to open and close, and to get the sense of separation in it, so someone can feel it. So it's really the way to learn it, and we must. I think that's some of what we must have done. I can't think of really doing it any other way, to tell you the truth, but it's a long time ago now. And then going back to that quality of mind, you know, what does he call it, the pass-off, you know, if somebody's pumping your joint and they slowly, you know, let go, and all of a sudden you're supposed to do it yourself, that's really the next, the mind there is much more active or has much more intent in terms of making the body do something initially. And you know, there's always an interplay through all this stuff of sort of turning the mind off and just paying attention to what's happening, because all these things happen. This pulsation, as Sito said, it's a universal rhythm that's on stellar scale and molecular scale. The technique is to learn that. Somebody's really got to do it to you first, and that's why it is so unusual for people. It's one thing for people to start to get their mind into their body, but then to start to do something internally with their mind and their body, that's when they really start to, you know, their eyes start to open up, and their level of awareness is new. And if you show somebody, as I have, I can open and close with, say, the joint in my wrist, that's an easy one, and you have them put their finger on your wrist and the little hollow there, and you don't move at all, and it opens and closes. They, you know, the look on their face often is like, my God, what are you doing? That's what's so foreign, is that you're doing something inside. But those you know, those physical techniques that are like Qigong Tuina, or could be used as a Qigong Tuina technique, they are the way to help somebody learn how to feel any particular joint and get the process going and begin to understand it.
You know, I'm glad you're talking about this, and Don is asking me a question on the side here about what the student experience is like actually going through that process. I'm going to share this with my students afterwards, and it's a big relief to me right now that you guys are all using the same kind of language, because they just think I'm crazy when I talk about opening and closing. I was like, come here, feel my shoulder, feel how that moves this way or that way, or the, you know, whatever it is. It is such a foreign experience for people to learn how to move in this way, and maybe people can weigh in. But for me, so first, a couple things about how we teach this at Brookline Tai Chi so that people kind of get on board with it. There are two main entry points for people learning this stuff. For the most part, for sure, most people come through our program and they do Tai Chi all the way through. And historically, we're going on about 20 years of data right now. Historically, with that flow, there was a certain point around maybe a year and a half or 2 years that there would be a major branch off where the people who started to get more interested in the internal principles of Tai Chi would jump into an Energy Gates class. So if you picture the majority of the people kind of flowing through our program, most of them came in seeing the Tai Chi form, seeing the external movements, and wanting to do a lot of that external choreography. So we take them through that process and slowly introduce Qigong principles over time. So there was a big jumping off point then to some pretty serious standing work. And once at that point they're on this path, again, depending how linear you want to be with it, they're on this path of going through Energy Gates and then Heaven and Earth and then kind of on into the other sets. A much smaller group is fanatical about standing from the very beginning. So they come in and they want to check out standing. They don't care about any of the choreography, and they dive right into it. So we definitely see most people are their sort of experience is in line with what you guys are talking about, that it's so different that we don't even try to introduce this stuff from the beginning. And that, I feel like that's been a good way to finally kind of follow that progression and finally acclimate people so that by the time they get to a Heaven and Earth class, if we're doing opening and closing in the class, we're probably doing 40 minutes of pulsing. And in an hour class, we're doing a little bit of warm-up, we dive right into pulsing, and we do a short set of Heaven and Earth at the end. So there is a certain point once they've learned the basics of Heaven and Earth where that's all people come in for, is to get the joints opening and closing. And then we're able to do the hands, the arms, the feet, and eventually after 3 or 4 rounds of that, you get into the cavities. But I definitely think you're right. It's a small subset. So that's cool. Lucy's saying that, well, here, you want to go ahead and explain what you just said about a different approach?
Sure, yeah. No, what I was saying was that I kind of sometimes do the opening and closing the wrist joint exercise that one does, as a partner exercise when teaching it. Sometimes do that as a kind of party trick with friends who, when I'm trying to explain a little bit about what Qigong's about and explain some of the components of it. And even with people who've never done any Tai Chi or Qigong of any nature before, they obviously get it really quickly. And when I'm gradually, that point where you've got them to start moving the joint a little bit by themselves and a little bit with your encouragement.
Yeah.
And then you have that point where you gradually drop out of the exercise, and then the person who's learning how to do the pulsing suddenly takes over the exercise and the movement themselves. And they're usually just completely flabbergasted that this is happening to them. And I think sometimes it's quite a nice way to just do it and keep it really quite light and fun, because it's just a bit like a party trick.
Yeah, absolutely. And we always have to give the warning to that to students at that point, that if they really get into that kind of thing, then they're well on their way to becoming Tai Chi and Qigong nerds, and they shouldn't tell anyone else about what they've learned or what they think is cool about Tai Chi class, because nobody's going to appreciate it. So, yeah, I think the wrist pulsing specifically is a great one to share with people.
Well, I think it's worth pointing out in terms of the efficacy of this exercise as just for simple health, that I once taught for about 3 years a class of mostly older women from their 50s into their 70s at home at one of the Council on Aging. And I tried to teach them the whole Tai Chi form. I'm not sure whether we ever even finished the damn thing, but we also did some different Qigong. And at one point, I started teaching them heaven and earth. And I don't think other than the external move, I don't think I ever did much more than getting them to focus on bending and stretching in the qua as sort of the center of the movement. I don't think we ever did trying to get them to open and close their joints or anything. But we did it enough that they could go home and practice the exercise. And sometime a month or two after that, one of them came up to me and said, "Oh, I can't thank you enough. That exercise, I get up in the morning and I do 5 of them, and my neck, I have no arthritic pain in my neck for the rest of the day, and it's really helped with my golf game." I was like, okay, that's great, but to just, to learn the movements themselves, even without much of what we think of or like to think of, oh, it's so special because now I'm adding this internal component to it. You really could teach this exercise to people who barely know nothing, and they're going to get a lot out of it.
Yeah. I've actually had the opposite experience where I worked with a group of dancers once, and I didn't teach them any of the choreography at all. This is kind of along the lines of what Lucy was saying, that I just showed them how to pulse, and we were pulsing the ankles or something like that, and they were so into that. That's where the sort of exoticism of the movement, the way you're moving, to people who are really familiar with movement, that was a huge plus for them, because the idea of opening and closing was something that completely broadened their perspective on how to do movement in general. And so it's interesting. There's a powerful tool to go either way. Yeah. Well, this is good. Anybody have anything else heaven and earth related questions or recommendations or amazing insights? You've had students get several inches taller from doing heaven and earth. We've had that for energy gates for sure. Anything else you want to share before we wrap up? Yeah. Yeah. Okay, hold on. Two quick questions. First, I think these are both for you, Eric. Oh, we got a lot of questions. Excellent. All right, Sito, why don't you go first with that question?
Okay, am I up?
Yep.
And I'm happy to defer to someone else because this might open a can of worms, and you're the moderator, so I'll let you just decide. But you and Eric both spoke on maybe two opposite sides of the spectrum in terms of how to teach and how much to teach and how strictly to adhere to the specific program that we were given during the teacher training. Eric talked about just doing some of the external forms, and he talked about just doing the pulsing. And I'm just curious, there's a lot of space in there in terms of how to break these components up and teach them.
Yeah.
And that might be the topic, but I'm curious as to people's thoughts on how to do that without losing some essence.
Yeah, and Don actually just sort of sent me a note about circling hands as well, and that was another key component of what we did in that 2004 training. So, Eric, you want to take that one first?
Well, I think that it's a progression, and for instance, the class of the elderly ladies, I could only do so much with them, and they could do so much, and so, I kept things simple with them, and that's so you couldn't do that with younger people too. But I think that if I had an ongoing set of classes where I was working on this, I think I'd spend the first few weeks really on the physical basics of circling hands, to get the body to move in a unified fashion, to get the claw and the spine going right, and work on the two movements of heaven and earth, and then I would spend the time doing what Danny was talking about it's great to learn all this pulsing, but you need a vehicle, other than it being sort of an interesting thing, you need a vehicle to train it, and this is the perfect vehicle to train it, and to then go through and drill those things in so that you're let's say you're doing, so then you get to, okay, now we're going to do opening and closing the hands, and all right, now we're going to open and close the hands in circling hands, now we're going to open and close the hands in the marriage of heaven and earth. Now we're going to do the feet, and eventually linking it all together, and then doing some of the same sort of training practice for the people. If you could continue a class into these things of getting the qua or the dandian or different parts of the body to be the driver to charge or regulate the opening and closing, and then eventually it's working on getting all of those things to work smoothly together, because in the beginning it's easier to get these joints in the hands to open and close because we use our hands all day long, but other parts of the body it's a little harder to get, and eventually you want to have all of this smooth out and begin to function as sort of part of one piece in a easily regulated basis method. So it's a progression, and I would always start with the external shapes and what you're doing in space, and slowly add these internal components to it.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, and that's the kind of high level overview of what the developmental process is. But I think the thing that we see at Brookline Tai Chi is that there's a bit of, for us teaching this stuff, it's a bit of a numbers game too, where only a certain number of people are going to go all the way through the process that Eric's talking about. And so you kind of have to choose sort of which signposts along the road you're going to show people at different times. Like that dance group, I knew I was going to see them for 2 hours. So my thinking was, I'm not going to impress them very much by teaching them commencement or the opening move of the short form, or try to get through single whip. They could all hang with that, and that wouldn't have really changed how they understood what was going on in Tai Chi or Qigong. So that was a good example of a case where I thought that here's something they don't know about. And I mean, Bruce even said, sort of like when he came back from China, he said most of the people he saw teaching in the States weren't talking about the qua and weren't talking about opening and closing. So from that point of view, there's a lot of room to kind of get stuff out like that. Now, how we doing, guys? Is everybody still here with me? I can't tell if I've lost you. Okay, great. Don, I'm wondering, I think we lost Eric here, so who's going to fill in? No. Don, for some of your classes, sorry, put you on the spot here. For some of your classes, you're teaching like at a college, or you're teaching a fixed curriculum like that, or a fixed time frame like that. How do you make some of these decisions Sito's asking about in terms of the scope of a curriculum that you'd share with a group?
Right. Yeah. I have been teaching for a few years groups of acupuncture oriental medicine students, as well as massage therapy students. So I think those are good examples of when it's, like you said with your dancers, it's a very specific audience. So you're trying to figure out what it is that will maybe be the best benefit for them at this point. So for example, with massage therapists, I didn't worry too much about the physical movements of any Qigong that I was teaching them, mm-hmm. but giving them, teaching them a little bit about the opening and closing, especially doing it to someone else, as in the Qigong Tuina. I figured that's something that, going out into the world as massage therapists would be a good tool for them to have, both for themselves as well as for their clients. With the acupuncture students, because they're going out into the world as, what in the West, at least what we consider to be the highest level professionals in Chinese medicine, I was much stricter about them learning the physical shell of any Qigong that I was teaching them.
I see.
Because they're going out, they're going out and representing this to the world in a certain way. So it was sort of a different focus with those different groups.
Got it. No, that makes a lot of sense here.
And then the other thing is that sort of thinking more about in terms of teaching the public, one of the things that's kind of happening in the Tai Chi and Qigong world is there's quite a few systems out there that are calling themselves easy Tai Chi, or in some way even more simplified, which is something that, even people like Chen Menqing simplified their Tai Chi form, but it's even getting to the point where it's almost losing a lot of the qualities that makes it valuable sometimes. Mm-hmm. But I'm thinking that something like teaching circling hands, or calling it Tai Chi 101 or something,
right,
might be a good way to get people doing something, giving them something that's really simple in terms of physical movement, but it still gives them some quality Qigong.
Interesting. Yeah. Good. Eric, are you still with us? Did we lose you?
I'm here, Danny.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
Somebody tried to call me and it cut it all off, and I couldn't unmute myself. So.
Well, I'm glad you're back because we have some great questions for you. Lucy, do you want to go ahead with the follow-up question on teaching, and then maybe we can circle back to your other one on the microcosmic orbit?
I think they were both the same question. But,
excellent.
Anyway, my question really was because at what point would you introduce the whole issue of the macro and microcosmic orbit? Would you say that's really a pretty advanced level piece of information? And also, can you go into it a little bit, because I've never totally grasped it?
Excellent.
Well, that's a good reason not to be teaching it.
That's not why I do it.
It's been a while since he's made a particularly big deal about it one way or the other in the Marriage of Heaven and Earth, but I would say I've always I'll back up for a minute. When in Denver, he used to teach, his method, what he was teaching and the way he was teaching. Some of it was before he spent a lot of time with the Yohun Jae, so it was a little more fire method oriented. It was a little more based on some of what he'd learned in Taiwan, and he did teach the macrocosmic orbit in the context of standing, and he didn't teach what we would now call spiraling energy body, but to some extent it was similar. And so I had an exposure to that early on, and I would not myself probably really think about even teaching any of the microcosmic orbit or the macrocosmic orbit in the marriage of heaven and earth unless some people really had some serious practice and had some exposure to spiraling where they were beginning to move energy up and down the body in a way that's different than, activating the inner yang meridians and or working with moving the energy the way you do in Dragon and Tiger. In the first movement is a macrocosmic orbit move, and the second movement is a microcosmic orbit move, but it's a fairly advanced part of the exercise.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I've noticed, and Don was saying this too about, it's a concept that his acupuncture students understand, and I certainly know that people who come in with other exposure to Qigong, it's a fairly familiar, for the people who know about Qigong, it's common for them to have some kind of experience with it. So it is useful when you can kind of relate systems, even though they're distinct systems, kind of relate from one to the other like that.
Yeah, I mean, the way he's taught, at least in the first move, the lengthening or getting movement on the inner, the yang meridians of the body, which is often really sort of dealing with gross surfaces like the inside of the legs or the outside of the legs, the inside of the arms, the outside of the arms. There's an aspect of the macrocosmic orbit that isn't much different than, bringing things up the body one way and sending them down the other, and bringing them from the feet out to the hands and up to the top of the head, and then back in, down the front, and down to the floor. And so learning to get some movement in the yin and yang meridians is a good foundation for playing with that and beginning to get some sense of it, particularly if you don't have much exposure to spiraling. But then the microcosmic orbit, the way it's done in heaven and earth, it doesn't fit those things because you're bringing energy up the spine while you're bringing everything else into the center. So it's one of those you're doing one thing one way and another thing another way, which is what happens in some of these Qigong sets when you're trying to do or when it's possible to do 3 or 4 or 5 or more different things at once. So the meridian stuff is useful for beginning to get the flow of it, but it doesn't always match up.
Got it. Great. Okay. Well, just take a second and ping me real quick if there's anything else you want to cover. Otherwise, I think we've done a nice, good job today. And if anybody's still listening to this recording at this point, they can consider that their Qigong practice for the day. So thank you, guys. Thanks for joining me again today. And if this works out, if this comes out nicely and people find it a useful tool, I'm looking forward to doing stuff like this more in the future. So thanks again, and I will talk to you soon.